And we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery, where we are going to try and do chapters 6 and 7 of Bava Metziah, Perek Vav and Perek Zayin. So strap in, get your books at the ready, and here we go. We're going to get ourselves underway. In chapter 6, we are going to be dealing with situations of hired workers and the disagreements that they can sometimes get into with the balabayas, with the person who is employing them or giving them some work. So in Mishnah Aleph, if Reuven was to hire workers, can one party renege on the agreement before the work starts? So the Mishnah says as follows: Hasoicher es ha'umanin. If you are hiring craftsmen, Vehitu ze es ze, and one of them misleads the other, or they mislead one another. Ein lahem ze al ze ela teremes. They only have a complaint against each other, a grievance against each other. Sachar es hachamar, ve'es hakadar. If a person hires a person who drives donkeys, ve'es hakadar, or a person who drives a wagon, lahavi piriyafarin v'chalilim lakala olames, and they are hired to bring smooth wood in order to build coffins, or to bring flutes that are going to be used to play in honor of a bride or for a dead person. Or he hired workers to bring up his flax from the vat, which is a time-sensitive job. And any type of job in which loss can be easily incurred if it's not done on time because it's time-sensitive. And the person who is doing the work backs out at the last minute and he's not going to do the job. So there's going to be a loss involved over here. So the Mishnah says, Makom she'ein sham adam, in a place where it's impossible to replace that worker, Makom she'ein sham adam, in a place where there's no other person who can get the job done for the same price, Socher alehen, then you can go and hire replacements for more money, and the people who you had hired originally are going to have to pay the difference because they've let you down on a time-sensitive issue. Or matan, or you can deceive them to get them back to work. So you can hire the originals for more money, but you're only to pay them the original price. So that's the buyer's rights, I guess, the hirer's rights in these kinds of situations. Mishnah base, dealing with a worker who's working for a fixed rate for a job called a kablan. So the Mishnah says, person hires a craftsman to do some work for you, and they back out, they renege on the deal midway through the work. Yadan ala tachtona, so they are at a disadvantage. So if half the job is done and they quit, then the person who's been doing the work is going to be worse off, going to be at the disadvantage, because they have to ensure that the employer doesn't suffer a loss. In Balabay's chayzebol, but if it's the employer who backs out, then yado ala tachtona kol mashane. So yado ala tachtona, then he is going to be at the disadvantage. Kol mashane, anybody who deviates and changes the terms accepted by both parties, yado ala tachtona. That's the general rule. They are going to be at the disadvantage. And whoever backs out is going to be at a disadvantage. Mishnah Gimel, dealing with a person renting an animal and something happens to that animal. So, Mishnah Gimel, a person who hires a donkey, in order to do a journey through a mountain or up a mountain. But instead, he leads it through a valley. So he changes where he is planning to take this donkey. So he hired it to go on a mountain, which is steep, but it's cooler temperature. And instead he goes through a bika, which is more comfortable terrain, but it's much hotter. Or conversely, babika va'alicha bahar, he hired it to go through a valley, and instead he went up a mountain. Afilu zot es milin v'zot es milin, even if both paths were a distance of 10 mil, so he hasn't gone further and pushed it harder in that sense, but he's changed the climate, he's changed the terrain. So while this happens, vamesa, the animal dies. So the Mishnah says chayav, he is going to be liable to compensate the owner of the donkey. Whereas otherwise, if he was hiring it and did exactly what it said on the tin, then he wouldn't necessarily be liable for if the animal ended up dying. He hires a donkey, and I have written here that it became blinded. It says on the screen over there that it became ill. Or shenases angaria, or it was seized by the king's men for use by the king. Then the Mishnah says, Omer lo harei shalach lefanecha. So then the person who has hired the animal can say, the owner can say to the renter, it's not my fault. It's still in front of you. And so if you want, you can go and get it back. You can go and deal with it. But it's not up to the owner to reimburse the person who's hiring the animal. Mesa or nishbara, but if it died or broke a bone, then chayav lahamid lo chamor. Then the owner is obligated to provide the renter with another donkey. I guess the practical implications would be if you rent a car nowadays. So a person who hires a donkey to go up a mountain and instead he led it through a valley, im hechalika patur, if it slipped and injured itself, he is going to be patur, because the terrain was expected to be difficult to navigate. So you're more likely to slip on a mountain, and so if it ends up slipping in the valley, then you're going to be exempt from damages. V'im hu chama, but if it was to get heat stroke, then chayav, then the person's going to be liable to compensate because you've taken it in a hotter climate. Says the Mishnah, you intended to take it in the hotter, smoother valley, but you instead went up a steep, cooler mountain. Im hechalika chayav. So if it slips on this rocky terrain, then you're going to be chayav. Vim hu chama patur, and if it got heat stroke, then you're going and died, then you're going to be exempt. Im machmas hama'ala chayav, and if it suffered because of the steep angle, then you're also going to be chayav. Mishnah Daled. What if some damage happened, but not because you misused the item? So the Mishnah says, you hired a cow to plow in order to plant on the mountain, and instead you went and plowed in the valley instead. If the yoke broke, then the Mishnah says, pater, then you're going to be exempt because it was even more likely to break on the rocky terrain of the mountain, and you went and did it in a valley. If you planned to plow in the valley and instead you went to plow on the mountain, so if the peg of the plow breaks, then you're now going to be chayav because you have taken this animal in a worse situation than you planned originally. Says the Mishnah, ladush bakitnis v'dash batfua. You planned to have it thresh legumes, and instead you took it to thresh grain. So legumes are more slippery to thresh. So it's harder. So if it got damaged while it was threshing through the grain, and pater, it's going to be exempt. But if you planned to have it thresh your grain and instead you took it to thresh your legumes, then chayiv, it's going to be liable. It's because it's more slippery and so it's more prone to injury. Mishnah Hey, going to be talking about overloading animals. Now, there's two ways you can overload an animal. One is to put more weight on the animal than had been agreed in your deal. And the second way is to apply greater volume. So barley has more volume, and therefore you could be liable even if it's the same weight as something else. Straw has more volume. I guess it's like the age-old question: what's heavier, a ton of rocks or a ton of feathers? So that's similar to what we're dealing with over here, I guess. So the Mishnah says, so a person hired a donkey to be able to bring, call it, few kilos of wheat, and instead you brought a few kilos of barley, you're going to be chayev if you cause damage, because barley has more volume to achieve the same amount of weight. Tavua vehevia leha teven chayav. If you planned to bring grain and instead you brought straw of the same weight, then chayav. Because the volume is also going to be more difficult for the animal, and it's going to be overloading the animal on account of the volume. If a person plans to bring a lesech, which is half a kor, 15 sa'ah, so you bring a lesech of wheat and instead you bring sa'orim, then the Mishnah says patur, because that should be a lighter substance than bringing the wheat. V'im hosif al masa'o chayav. But if he adds to a load, then he is going to be liable. So if he adds a third to the load from the agreed weight, then you're going to be chayav. V'chama yosef al masa'o v'hei chayav. How much do you have to add to a load to become liable? Sumchus omer mishum Rabbi Meir. Sumchus says in the name of Rabbi Meir, sa'al agamal. If you add up to if you add a sa'ah or more to a camel, you're going to be liable. So a camel can hold 30 sa'ah. So you can, so if you add a sa'ah to a gamal, to a camel, then you're going to be chayav. Shlosha kabin lechamor, and 3 kabin for a donkey. A donkey can hold about 15 sa'ah. A sa'ah is 6 kav, so therefore 3 kav is half of a sa'ah, and so that's the measurement for a donkey. Mishnah Vav. We're going to be discussing what the status of a person is who takes someone's utensils in order to make something for him. So he's a hired worker, and since he's a shomer sachar, he's a hired worker, if something gets stolen or lost, he's going to be chayav. Says the Mishnah, Kol ha'umanim shomer sachar hen. All craftsmen have the status of a shomer sachar, someone who is being hired for a fee. And anyone who says, take what is yours and bring the money, so until that occurs, that person is now a shomer chinam. Even if it's still in his possession, he is a guard who is being employed for free. Shemor li ve'eshmor lach. If a person says, look after my stuff and I will look after your stuff, shomer sachar. This is the equivalent of a hired worker, because he's only guarding if the other will return the favor. Shemor li va'amar lo hanach lefanai shomer chinam. If a person says, look after my stuff, and the other guy says to him, put it in front of me, then shomer chinam. Then he would have the halacha of a shomer chinam. And obviously that's going to have nafkaminas if things get damaged or lost, depending on whether they are considered a shomer chinam or shomer sachar. Mishnah Zayin. hilvahu ala mashkon. So if a person lends money with the intention to take collateral, so what kind of shomer is he on the collateral? So you've lent someone £1,000 and you take his suit, whatever, as collateral. So if he doesn't pay it back, he's going to lose the suit. So shomer sacha, you become a hired worker on the collateral. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer hilvahu maos shomer chinam. Rabbi Yehuda says if you lend money to somebody, then you become a shomer chinam for the collateral. But hilvahu peiros and shomer sachar. But if you lend food, produce to someone, then you would be a shomer sachar on the collateral. Abba Shal Omer muta adam lahaskim mashkona shel ani liyos posek alav holech. It is permitted for a person to rent out a poor person's collateral that was given to him during the period of a loan, so that by setting a rental price, he will therefore progressively reduce the debt, i.e. the lender will subtract the rental money he receives from the amount owed by the borrower. So even though you're holding on to this collateral, you're going to tangibly benefit from the fact that it's in your possession, and the money that you earn will act as additional payment to the loan. So the Mishnah says you can do this because this is considered like returning lost property. The borrower is going to profit from the arrangement, and so therefore he's allowed to do it. And finally, for this chapter, Mishnah Ches, Hamarvir chavis mimakom lemakom ushavar, a person who is transporting a barrel from one place to another, and it got broken. Ben shomer chinam ben shomer sachar, whether he was an unpaid worker or a paid worker, yishaver, he nonetheless has to swear in court that he was not negligent and he was not responsible for the damage caused. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ze vazeh yishaver. Rabbi Eliezer says that the paid worker and the unpaid worker have to take an oath in order to exempt himself from payment. But I wonder whether they both can take an oath. In other words, this is what I heard from my teachers, but I'm not really sure I understand the ruling. I can relate to you, Rabbi Eliezer. But with that we say, Mazel Tov on completing chapter 6, and let's dive into the world of chapter 7. Talking about arrangements between a person and his worker. So an uman is hired for a job. A poel is hired for a day's work. So that's the difference between an uman and a poel. So biblically, a poel, a day's worker, can be fed from the produce they are working with. So we're going to be dealing with workers who are not working with food and what the customs are for how and when they are entitled to eat. So fundamentally, if the person who's employing this worker didn't specify the working times when he hired him, then it's going to depend on the local custom as to whether or not a person is going to be able to take food. If the custom is to give food and you specify that they can have food and that you're going to give them food, then it's machlokes how much you have to give. So let's have a look at this. Perek Zayin, Mishnah Aleph. You hire a worker, a day worker, and you tell them to get up exceptionally early and to work until exceptionally late. So makom shenahagu shelo lahashkim v'shelo laha'ariv. If you are living in a place where it's not the custom to really do this, then eino rashai lekofan, then the employer is not permitted to compel them to do so. Makom shenahagu lazun, if it's a place where employers you'd usually feed their workers, yazun, then you are also expected to feed the workers. L'sapek b'mesika yisapek, if it's a place where employers will typically give some sweet foods to their workers, then you too have to supplement this food for your workers. Hakol kamin haga medina, everything goes by the place in which you live. Maaseh Rabbi Yochanan ben Metziah. There's a story that happened with Rabbi Yochanan ben Metziah where he was in a place where it was the minhag to give food anyway. And he said, Shamar Livno, he said to his son, say Sechor lani po'olim, go out and find us some workers. So, halachu pasach lehem mazonos. He went out and got some workers and he pledged to give them food as part of their employment. Didn't specify the details there. And when he came back to his father, Amar lo, he said to him, B'ni, my son, afilu imata osa lahen kesudas shlam b'shata, lo yatzasa yidei chovascha imahen. Even if you were to put on a sumptuous feast like that of King Solomon in his time, you will not have fulfilled your obligation to them because you didn't specify what they were entitled to have. Shehein b'nei Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, because they are the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and you can never be too sure what they should be entitled to. But if they haven't yet started work, then go out and say to them, as long as they can understand that before they start to work for you, that it's on the condition that you are only going to be providing them with some bread and with some legumes, and not a feast fit for a king. Rabbi, I should really tell Shira about this. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Lo hayat tzarich lomar hakol k'minhag hamadini. He would say, you would not need to state this condition because everything goes by the place. So assuming you're not living in a place where everyone gets fed like King Solomon, you're not going to have to supply them with that much food. Mishnah base. Biblically, they can eat from what they are working with. So it's interesting because the Torah says that an ox may not be muzzled when threshing, and a worker, when plucking in a vineyard, may eat. And so fundamentally, there's going to be some rules as to what they're allowed to take and when, depending on what kind of area they're working in, what kind of part of the process they're working in. And so let's take a look at this. These are the ones who may eat. These are the workers who may eat with the permission of the Torah. The person who is working with produce that's attached to the ground at the time of the completion of the work, meaning at the time when he is harvesting from the ground. If he was just tending to the land, if he was weeding and pruning, then he would not be allowed to eat. But if he is harvesting the fruits, he's harvesting the land, then he's going to be entitled to eat as he goes along. And if he is working with detached food, detached produce from the ground, and it's before it was processed and before it's liable to be tithed, then the worker is going to be entitled to eat that as well. And that is provided that he is working on the produce itself and not doing something else. And these are the ones who biblically should not be eating while they are working. A person who is working with produce which is attached to the ground, but it's not at the time when that food should be eaten because it's still growing. Or when it's food that is detached from the ground and it's sufficiently processed and therefore subject to tithes, then the person is not allowed to eat it. And if it's something that is not growing from the ground, then they shouldn't be eating unless there was a practice in the area or they'd made a prior arrangement. So absent of those details, person's not going to be entitled to eat. Mishnah Gimel. Haya oser v'yadav aval lo baraglav. If a worker was performing labor with his hands but not with his feet, If he was performing work with his feet but not with his hands, for example, he might be pressing grapes, then the Mishnah says, even if he is performing labor with his shoulders, he would be entitled to eat. So it's not important what type of work he's doing. If it's in the area and in the parameters of being able to eat the fruits, the produce, then he's going to be allowed to. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, the worker may only eat if he is performing work with his hands and with his feet, meaning that he's only working in the same way, I guess, that an animal would work. So an animal who's entitled to eat when it's threshing, it would be using its hands and its feet, and therefore a worker would also have to be using his hands and his feet in order to be entitled to eat. So I guess that doesn't necessarily mean doing work, but maybe walking around would qualify, and not just kind of, I guess, sitting while, maybe a practical implication here could be sitting at a conveyor belt, so the produce is going past him, but he's not working with his feet necessarily. Whereas if he's walking around, then I guess he would be. Mishnah Daled, a worker may only eat from the type of produce that he is working with. So again, we're talking about things that belong to the balabayas, but the worker is entitled to eat them while he is working for this balabayas. So biblically, a worker can only eat while they are doing work. So the Mishnah says, Haya oseb te'enim, if he was working with figs, Lo yochal ba'anavim, he can't eat the grapes. That might also be in the same area. But anavim, if he's working with the grapes, lo yochal b'te'enim, he can't eat the figs. Aval monea es atzmo ad shemagia lemakom ayafos va'achel. But what he can do is hold himself back from eating a particular type of produce so that he can reach the better quality stuff, and then he would still be entitled to eat from that. All of this that we're saying is only when he's working. But because of the obligation to return lost property to an owner, they say that a worker may eat as they walk from one row of a vineyard or one furrow of a field to the other. And also when he's on his way back from the wine press. So we can let them eat when they're moving around, even though they're not working at the time, because that's going to ultimately be to the owner's benefit. And with regards to a donkey, it's permitted to eat when it's being unloaded, which is something that gets explained in the Gemara. Mishnah Hay, fundamentally, a worker can eat as much as they want. So, ochel poel kishus afilu bedinar. A person can eat cucumbers while he's working on cucumbers, even to the expense of a dinar. V'choseves afilu bedinar, and even dried figs he could eat a dinar's worth. Rabbi Elazar ben Chisma says, Lo yochal poel yose al schara. A worker is not allowed to eat more than the salary he would otherwise be paid. So he's going to be getting paid separately, but he shouldn't eat more than the value of what is being paid. And the Chachamim say this is mutar. Aval, however, adam ra'avsan. But you should probably train these people and teach these people and explain to these people that they shouldn't be so gluttonous, because they'll get a reputation. People will just shut the door in their face if they know that they're going to be losing out because of the amount that this person is planning to eat while he does the job. So then you've got to be careful, and you don't want that reputation. Mishnah Vav, fundamentally, a worker can forego food in return for extra pay. So they can agree and make a deal that they won't eat anything while they're working, but they should be compensated for that. So the Mishnah says, a person can make a deal on his own behalf, or alidei bano, or on behalf of his adult son, uvito hagadolim, his adult son or daughter, alidei avdo, on account of his slave, on behalf of his slave, v'shiv chaso hagadolim, and his adult maidservant or slave, alidei ishto, or on behalf of his wife, because they all have a basic level of competence and therefore they can waive their rights. Aval Eina Kotzetz Alidei Beno Vita Ktanim, but he cannot make this arrangement on behalf of minor children, Velo Alidei Avda V'Shichchasa Ktanim, and not on behalf of slaves and maidservants who are children, Velo Alidei Behemta, and not on behalf of his animal, Mipnei She'ein Bahem Das, because they are not capable of really appreciating the sacrifices being made, and therefore they would just want to be eating anyway. So the idea here is that because it stands to gain for a person to not eat while they're on the job because they'll get more money afterwards. So as long as someone can understand this, you can make this arrangement on their behalf. But if they can't understand that arrangement, then you can't. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Zion, talking about a unique situation where workers thought they were entitled to eat, but actually they weren't. So the Mishnah says, if a person hires workers to attend to his produce, but this produce is 4 years old, and therefore there's a halacha of neta Rabbi, which is where the fruit is not permitted to be eaten. Hare elu lo yochelu, these things cannot be eaten. So in the 4th year of something that's been planted, like a tree, so the produce is to be taken to Yerushalayim and redeemed in Yerushalayim, or it's meant to be redeemed and the money is taken to Yerushalayim, in which case you would be able to eat the food. But fundamentally, the owner is supposed to inform them of why they won't be able to eat the food that they are working with. So says the Mishnah, if he's hired to work with this produce, they can't eat it. But if the owner did not inform them that they shouldn't be eating it, then then they can redeem the fruit and they can feed the fruit, eat the fruit. Nitparsu igulav. If there were pressed figs and they broke apart and crumbled and would need some work done to them again to make them fit for purpose, or nispatchu chaviosaf, or a barrel opened up, hare elu lo yochelu, then these things should not be eaten. So because they'd already reached their completed stage, and so workers not allowed to benefit from them, to eat them. In lohodian, but if the owner did not inform them that these things were finished and should not be eaten, then ma'aseh machilan, then he can tithe the food and then he can feed them this food. Mishnah Ches, we're talking about the basic halachot of shomrim, of different types of guards. So the Mishnah says, shomri peiros ochlin mehilchos medina. If someone is watching produce, meaning they're watching with their eyes, but not with their hands or their feet, so then they can eat the produce based on the local practice. Aval min haTorah, but they would not be allowed to min haTorah. So biblically, a shomer cannot eat the produce. A worker is different, a guard is different. Workers can eat, guards cannot eat. Says the Mishnah, Arba Shomerin Hen, a general point about the types of shomerin, the types of guards that the halacha talks about. One is a shomer chinam, an unpaid guard. V'hashoel, a shoel is someone who borrows an item, so they become responsible for looking after it. Nosei sachar, a person who is paid to look after it. V'hasoicher, and a person who pays money to hire an item. In which case, these are all people who are shomrim. They're all responsible for looking after it. And nosei sachar is going to be paid to look after it and is not allowed to use it. A socher pays for the right to be able to use it. So they're all going to have different halachas that apply to them in terms of the responsibility, the level of responsibility that they have for these things. Shomer chinam, someone who is unpaid and is looking after something, nishba al hakol, he is always going to have to swear an oath in every situation. So if the item got lost, if it got stolen, if it got broken, if the animal died, the person who's looking after this thing is going to have to swear an oath to describe what had happened. And if it wasn't his fault, and he swears that it wasn't his fault, then he won't have to pay. A person who borrows an item is going to be fully responsible and is going to have to pay irrespective of what happens, even if it was a circumstance beyond his control. The no-se sachar, a person who is paid to look after an item, or v'hasoche, or a person who pays to look after the item because he's hiring it, nishbaim ala shavura v'ala shavuya v'ala mesa. They're going to have to swear over something that happens if the item, if the animal got injured, or if it got captured, or if it died. And they're going to have to pay if it got lost or if it got stolen. Mishnah tests. We're going to be talking about whether things will qualify as ones or not, whether it was beyond their control or not. If it was an unpaid guard, they're always going to be exempt in a case of ones. But in other instances, then the person may still have to pay, depending on what kind of shomer level they were at. So the Mishnah says, Ze'ev echad. If if damage occurred because of one wolf attacking, it talks about a flock of sheep over here. So if one wolf attacks, not ones, then this would not be qualified as ones, presumably because you should have been able to keep it at bay. Shnei ze'evin, but if it's attacked by two wolves, then ones. This is going to be beyond his control. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Bish'as mishlachas ze'evin, if it's at a time of wolf attacks, it's a time or an area where wolves will typically attack, af ze'ev echad ones, and even one wolf is going to be beyond his control. Shnei chlavim eina ones, two dogs is not going to be beyond his control because they're not so vicious, generally speaking. Yadua habavli omer mishum Rabbi Meir. Yadua, the Babylonian, said in the name of Rabbi Meir, meruach achas eina ones. If it's coming from one direction, then it's not going to be beyond his control, and that's even if it's two dogs. And mishtei ruchos ones. And if it's two dogs coming from two different directions, then it is going to be beyond his control because he can't keep both sides under control. Halistim hareze ones. If he gets attacked by bandits, that's going to be beyond his control. If they get attacked by a lion or a bear or a panther, omai, or a bardalas, which is a cheetah, or a snake, hareze ones. These are all going to be circumstances beyond his control. Asks the Mishnah, no, emasai. When is this the case? Bisman shibau me'aleihen. This is when the animals or the bandits have come of their own accord. Aval im holichan lemakom gedudei chaya velistim eina ones. But if you led it purposely into mafia territory or into an area where there's a lion known to be around, then these things are not beyond your control, and you're going to be chayav because of your negligence. Mishnah Yud, Mesa Kedarka, Hareza Ones. If an animal dies in a regular way, then it's beyond that person's control. Sigpava Mesa, if he starved it or afflicted it and it dies, Eina Ones, then it's not beyond your control. Also, Laroshe Tsokim Venoflava Mesa, Hareza Ones. If an animal runs up a cliff and falls down and dies, that's beyond your control. Hela Laroshe Sokin Venoflava Mesa. But if it was brought up to the top of the cliff and then it fell down and died, Eina Ones, then that's not beyond your control. Masne Shomer Chinam Liyos Patim Mishavua. If there's a prior arrangement that the Shomer Chinam, that the unpaid guard, is going to be trusted on whatever he says, Pater Mishavur, then he won't need to swear in court if something happens. Vashoel Lios Pater Milashalem, and someone who borrows an item, and if he stipulates and makes a deal that he's going to be exempt from having to pay if anything happens to it, and a paid guard and someone who hires an item can make a deal beforehand that they should be exempt from having to swear or from having to pay. So if these arrangements are being made, if you're redefining the terms of the shmirah for different reasons, then that can be upheld in a court of law. And finally, for this evening, Mishnah Yud Aleph, a general rule in all of the Torah, says the Mishnah, some more laws about conditions. Kol hamasne al mashakasav b'Torah. Anyone one second. Just trying to think of how I can best explain this. Because it talks about Masha Kasab Torah, that which was written in the Torah. So what we're about to see is derived from the agreement that Moshe made with the 2.5 tribes before they entered Israel. Right? The deal that he made was that if the 2.5 tribes go into Eretz Yisrael with them and fight with them, then they will be entitled to land on the other side of the Yarden. But if they didn't keep to that condition, then they would have had to live inside the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael with them. So the point here is that there is a condition attached to the deal that's being made. And the Mishnah says, Kol masne al masha kasu b'Torah t'na'o batel. If you make a condition on something that is written in the Torah, right, okay, this is what's going on. If you make a condition which contradicts something that's written in the Torah, Mark's nodding his head now. Good. The trouble was that the translation on the screen is not helpful. So if you make a condition, we got there in the end. If you make a condition for a deal which would violate the Torah, then tanal batel, then that condition is null and void. It's useless. It's you can't contravene the Torah, even though it's a deal and an agreement that you're making with someone else. And any condition which is dependent on something being done first, then the condition is void and the promise remains intact. But if it's something that could eventually be fulfilled, and that was stipulated in advance, then the tna'o kayam, then the condition is binding. The condition is valid. But if the condition cannot be fulfilled at all, then once the action has been carried out, the condition is void. So let's see if I've understood this correctly. Anything against the Torah is going to be void. You must state the condition first, and the condition must be possible to fulfill. And if those things are met, then the condition is going to be valid and binding. And with that, we say Mazel Tov on completing Perek Zion. And sadly, that is all we have time for this evening. So thank you all. Have you had the words on the screen at all tonight? Why didn't you say anything?
I want to interrupt you, and I was understanding what you were saying anyway.
Oh my goodness gracious! I'm like looking at the screen now. I'm realizing there's nothing for me to take away. I'm so sorry.
Excellent.
Please feel free to interrupt me. That's so frustrating. I'm so sorry, but that's all we've got time for. Let's end the broadcast and then